Brilliant. Just give us 10 seconds. It's just starting up on YouTube and then we'll start the webinar. So Samantha, I'll pass over the host privileges to you and you can turn the webinar on.
Let's start.
Great. Well, we are live whenever you are ready.
Great. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for coming to the Stay at Home Literature Festival. And this event is on hidden gems. So it's some fascinating things that we have discovered while researching our novels. And we're 4 novelists. We're all from Bristol and we're all in the Just Right Authors Collective. So we're each going to talk for about 10 minutes and tell you the 3 most fascinating things that we discovered while researching our books. If you have questions, please feel free to jot them down in the chat and we'll try and come to them at the end. And if you want to see just the person who's speaking, use the speaker view on Zoom, which is usually kind of at the top left, top right. And we'll have some slides and things for you to see as well. Oh, and it's being recorded, so turn off your video if you don't want to be seen. Oh, I don't think, maybe no one can be seen anyway. Without further ado, I'd love to introduce our first speaker, Kerry Postle, who's written a range of historical and other fiction books published with HarperCollins.
Thank you, Heather, and thank you for listening in this afternoon. Welcome to the Stay at Home Literature Festival. So my name is Kerry Postle, and as Heather's just said, I have written mainly historical novels, and I've written 3 historical novels, and that fits perfectly with this afternoon because I'm going to share 3 hidden gems with you. Now, research is key for any novelist, and a historical novelist in particular. It gives you that motivation and inspiration to actually give your book, put clothes on your novel, give it shape, colour, substance, and possibly, and most importantly, truth, especially from a historical context. Now, I'm going to share some slides with you to help explain what I've written and why I've written. And you'll see as well that I presume as well that for many novelists, this will be the case, that you have a sort of subconscious drive to say and have a similar message throughout your novels, which is what I've discovered when I've been preparing for this afternoon. So bear with me while I share my screens with you. So first off is I'm going to, if I can, I had this before, I'm sharing it. I'm going to talk about my first novel. Now, my first novel is called The Artist's Muse. And The Artist's Muse is, her name is Vali Neutzel, and the artist in particular is Egon Schiele. Now, the trigger for writing this was an exhibition I went to in 2015, and it gave me an insight into Egon Schiele. It was full of paintings of Vali Neutzel. However, it was a very Schiele-esque perspective. Together, they shocked society, they pushed the boundaries of art. So they were incredibly successful together. However, the success now is Egon Schiele's alone. And I felt after seeing the exhibition, I wanted to tell Vali's story. I wanted to see things from her point of view. And so the hidden gem that really gave me the context and my raison d'etre really was a non-fiction work by the writer Otto Weininger. And again, he's on the screen, you can see now. He wrote a book called Sex and Character in 1903, and it shocked me, and it may not shock you, but it certainly shocked me to discover that this was incredibly influential at the time. Many artists, much of society, espoused what he'd written about, and essentially it was a work of great misogyny. It was many other things as well. It was homophobic, it was anti-lesbian, it was anti-Semitic. But for my purposes, it was the misogynistic element that really influenced my writing. And it helped me understand Vali Neutzel's life. I wanted to explain it, I wanted to understand it, and I wanted to see her experience in that society's context, that Fantasiekel of Vienna. I'm going to choose 3 quotations as well to actually help you and give you an idea of why it was so important for me. So the first one I've chosen is No Men Who Really, I've gone the wrong way, I shall go back. No men who really, I can't see that, have a high regard about women, retain a high opinion of them. So basically, it's that awful view that women are of no importance. The next one is in those rare individual cases where women approach genius, they also approach masculinity. And again, it's that thing that women, even when they achieve greatness, cannot actually own that greatness. It's only ever been endowed upon them. They've either been influenced. You see that with many of the artists at the time. They were accused of copying men. So again, that they have no true worth. And the last one is woman is soulless and possesses neither ego nor individuality, personality nor freedom, character nor will. And linked to that was the idea that women, and this woman in particular, Vali Neutzel, was a woman without a soul. She was pure matter. And really, she became important only when she was imprinted by Egon Schiele. He gave her worth, he gave her some sort of meaning, and without him she was nothing. She was just a piece of flesh to have sex with, to shape, and to basically abandon when he'd finished with her. So for me, I really wanted to see her struggle, understand her perspective, and to see what she had to go through at the time. Bearing in mind that I really like Egon Schiele's work, that really does need to be stressed. This isn't a sort of Philistine perspective, but it was just another way of seeing the artist's muse's perspective as opposed to just the artist. My next novel, in fact, it's my third novel, but I'm putting it next, is called The Woman in the Painting. The reason I'm talking about it next is that there's a similarity and a parallel with the first one. Now, I really love Raphael and I wanted to write about him. I love Renaissance art, and during my research, I was looking for that particular angle. And again, my first angle was to go with the first a sex and character with Otto Weininger, and that gave me a particular context and perspective. With my Raphael novel, I wanted to write about his life, and I was looking for a specific way to approach it. When I was in the Villa Barberini in Rome, I found the painting you see before you, and it's called La Fornarina, and it means the baker's daughter. Now, underneath the painting, the curator's written that basically it's a painting of the woman that brought him down. Basically, he was made to give up this woman on his deathbed. She was sin, she was vice. That was a very specific view at the time. It became set in stone and became true myth when Giorgio Vasari, the art critic, wrote about Raphael's life, and Margherita Luti here became the woman that killed Raphael with an excess of sex. Now, really, that is ridiculous, but at the same time, it sort of crystallized where I was going with my research, where I wanted to go with my novel. So for me, I zoomed in on that. On the side of the slide, you can see a few drawings by Picasso, and it shows you that that idea that Margherita Luti killed Raphael, took genius away from us, really was an important myth that carried on, and people held on to it. She was mocked, she was vilified, she was hated also at the time. So really, I wanted to then write about Raphael, his life with her. And then, again, my hidden gem is the painting itself, and I was brought to it to look beneath the surface of it, because in 2005, and I put the specific quotation, I found in The Guardian these words: "Art sleuth uncovers clue to secret Raphael marriage." This made me scrape a bit further beneath the surface, and thanks to X-ray technology, underneath this painting of La Fornarina, you have myrtle and other matrimonial foliage, and also a wedding band on her finger, which was obviously painted over, and it made me then see the world completely differently, the experience completely differently. I knew I wanted to tell Margherita Luti's story, the story of La Fornarina, and this gave me some substance. This gave me the chance to tell her story and to tell a truth that was always there, even if it had been painted over, but also to choose a different optic, to give her a voice, if you like, and that felt very, very important to me. And again, it's a beautiful painting, even painted over, but to see what was hidden underneath and tell that story was something that I really wanted to do. So you're getting probably an impression of what drives me. And again, I'm going to go back to my second novel for my third hidden gem. Now, I've always been interested in the Spanish Civil War, and really I did want to write about it, but I thought I wanted to write about it from a sort of relationship point of view again, between a man and a woman on different sides, because the Civil War really does explode that awful feeling that, you know, even in the same family, you can be torn asunder on the same side. And, you know, people aren't necessarily suddenly bad. It's just that the war has torn you and put you in sides that you haven't necessarily been comfortable in accepting, but you have no choice. That was the main drive to begin with. But when I started my research, I discovered that it was the role of women that really made me want to give it a certain direction. And I discovered that before the Civil War, women were enjoying lots of new freedoms. The Russian Revolution had happened, and Europe was very afraid of communism at the time. And Spain was changing. The old guard, the old latifundistas were being cast asunder. They were very threatened. And women, especially in the big cities, they were enjoying new freedoms. They were having jobs. They could have sexual relationships. This was anathema to the old guard. And as soon as the Civil War broke out, they became a specific target. It was a systematic policy, if you like, of punishing women so that they would never, ever be allowed to have those freedoms again. And so in my novel, I chose one specific horrific fact that basically it was just outside a village in Andalusia. The nationalist soldiers had taken away 14 girls and women, took them to a finca. They got them to entertain them, to feed them. Then they raped them, they killed them, they threw them down a well, and they came back and they basically paraded with the girls and the women's underwear on their rifles as a message to the village. And again, this was perpetrated all throughout Spain. So again, it gave my main character, who was female in a relationship, it gave her something to fight against, contend with, and cope with. So really, my three hidden gems are, as you'll see, they have something in common. You have Fanny Neutzel, who had to fight against Otto Weininger's Saxon character, and that was the basic sort of societal view of women. Margarita Lutti, a lowly baker's daughter, also had to fight against how people viewed her, and plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. Really, people still think of it in that way. And a forbidden love, we have my heroine, Maria Alvaro, who again had to fight against that awful crushing of the female spirit. So again, you have my hidden gems. And let me get rid of my screen. I apologize for that. There are my three hidden gems. And again, something sort of connects them. And if you have any questions about anything I've said, please feel free to ask in the chat. And thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you, Kerry. I think I'm next. Hi, everyone. I'm Ali Bacon. I think my fascinating facts are a little bit different to Kerry's, maybe slightly more technical, but I hope equally interesting. They come from my most recent novel, which is called In the Blink of an Eye. And they're all from the world of early photography, which is where it mostly takes place. So if I can, I hope, share with you the right screen. Oops. Just failed to do that properly. There we are, that's better. You can see me all over again and the cover of my book. However, this is not the important thing. I want to share with you two images which were very much the inspiration for what I wrote. And they happen to feature the same man who was my main character, David Octavius Hill, an Edinburgh artist who teamed up with a scientist called Robert Adamson to form a very famous photographic partnership. And I thought I'd just draw attention to, well, I'm going to cheat and give you a few small facts about early photography in general. And looking at these two, what surprised me when I first saw them was the date at which they were created. If you rifle through your family photos, the earliest you're likely to find will be 1860 onwards. That's when photography became generally accessible. However, these are from 1843, so they're 20 years earlier. And to my mind, they're actually more appealing than a lot more of the later examples of Victorian photography. And in 1843, the photographic method had only just been invented by Fox Talbot, and the word photograph didn't really exist. People talked about sun pictures, painting with light, or painting with shadows. And Fox Talbot's name for this was the calotype, or beautiful picture. So these are usually referred to as calotypes. One or two other things which surprised me. Those of us, born before the digital age will remember photographic film, the slimy stuff. And in old dramas, we're familiar with people manhandling these big sort of metal plates that were used in the 19th century. But the pictures we're looking at now were actually made on paper from the get-go. They used paper for the negative and for the positive image. So that meant that the paper was obviously widely available, but of course it did create problems, especially in getting any consistency. The consistency of your pictures were only as good as the consistency of your paper. The other thing it does, it gives them a very particular characteristic, that sort of grainy appearance, which is because of the texture of the paper. And that came to be seen as a disadvantage, but for many people, it's still something that gives them a rather beautiful quality. Now, you probably are aware that in early photographs, exposure times were very long. So if you take a look at these two pictures, look for these poses, where someone is leaning on something or somebody else, somebody's holding a book or leaning on their elbow. These were all things that helped people stay still from between 1 and 3 minutes, which was what you had to do when you were having your picture taken. And there's another little bit of sort of slight chicanery going on, because although these look like interior scenes, in fact, they're all taken out of doors. So all these tables, drapes, backcloths, curtains, everything else were actually taken outside onto a very sunny south-facing courtyard garden where the studio actually took place. So it was rather a different proposition from what you might see in the pictures themselves. And then there was one final thing which I only discovered when I was quite close to the end of the book, and which actually rather took me aback. In fact, the calotype process does not render all parts of the colour spectrum in the same way. And it's not very good at presenting the sort of yellow and green end of the spectrum. I knew nothing about this until I read something about my hero, David Octavius Hill, having blonde hair. And I absolutely disputed this because I'd seen so many of these calotypes with him looking quite tall, quite handsome, and definitely very dark. But in fact, this was not the case. And here are two contrasting images, one from much later, 1854, compared to 1844. So you can see that my hero was not as I thought he was at all. He was a blonde. But never mind, I tried to avoid mentioning any of that when I was actually writing about him. So the camera of 1843 might not lie, but it can deceive just a little bit. Here's someone completely different we can have a look at. Hill and Adamson created portraits of hundreds of Edinburgh figures, friends, family, and local celebrities. But some of their most famous subjects were from another section of society. Newhaven is now a suburb of Edinburgh, but at that time it was a fishing village. The women wore distinctive dress and they went to Edinburgh to sell their fish in these big baskets. And of course, at that time, Edinburgh was notorious for the poverty, the slums, and the drinking dens of the old town. And by contrast, the people of Newhaven were held up as moral examples, really. Although they were poor, they had a strong sense of community and they ran their own schools. In this project, Hill and Adamson were really undertaking the first example of documentary photography, something that we now take for granted as part of news journalism. Anyway, the lady on the left, whose name is Elizabeth Johnson Hall, despite her humble origins, ended up by becoming one of the most famous photographic subjects of the entire century. And my last little nugget of information is about another lady. In view of all the difficulties of the calotype process, it did seem incredible that these two men created over 3,000 images in the space of 4 years. And it's come to light that they had a helper, and that helper was a woman. The first we know of her is in a letter where she's referred to as the thrice worthy Miss Man. And researchers have gradually built up a picture of this mysterious and talented lady who can probably claim to be the first woman photographer. So here she is, or as we now think she is. She was one of 3 sisters who lived close to Carlton Hill, where Hill and Adamson carried out their business. And she was possibly a childhood friend of David Octavius Hill. This portrait lay in the National Gallery of Scotland for quite a long time and was just called the Unknown Woman. So how do we know, or why do we think that this might be Jessie Mann? Well, you can see her left hand quite prominently. I don't know if you see my mouse, but anyway, it's quite easy to see. But it appears that her right hand is invisible, but actually it's not. It is here, and you would think it might be in deep shadow, but actually it's probably black, because all those early photographers had to do a lot of handling of silver nitrate, which does make your skin turn black. And that was quite a famous feature of early photographers. Something they were actually teased about was their black fingers. So this is why we think this is the mystery lady of the photographic partnership. Anyway, my novel is not actually about photography, but it is about lots of the people we've seen today: the First Lady photographer, the interesting subject from Newhaven, and the main character, who may have turned out tall, dark and handsome and turned out not to be. Anyway, thank you very much for listening. I think Heather has put all our book links in the chat if anyone wants to follow them up. And it is now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who is Jean Burnett with her Hidden Gems.
Unmute yourself, Jean.
Start again. Hello, everyone. Yes, my research is probably leans more towards historical quirky facts than serious matters, but there is one serious strain running through both the books I'm going to mention, and that is that women, despite the fact that socially the dice are loaded against them, could sometimes strike back and achieve revenge in one, or at least live the sort of life they wanted to lead. And in my first book, I was wandering down the elegant streets of 19th century Bath, having dared to write a spoof of Pride and Prejudice, which is called Who Needs Mr. Darcy? And in order to do the research for this book, all I had to do was make a short journey from Bristol to Bath and immerse myself in the archives of the Central Library in what is the Jane Austen Centre of the Universe. So that was quite easy to do. And while I was doing that, I became intrigued about what women at that period carried in what passed for a handbag. It was called a reticule. And if you have a rummage in the reticule, you can come up with some interesting details. What did they carry in these little things? Well, not just smelling salts and possibly love notes, but very often there would be a small bottle of gin and a small bottle of laudanum, that's heroin, of course. And this was for when things got too much, as they often did. I'm sure if you've watched Bridgerton, you'd know that, yes. Or as Jane Austen would say, I was not greatly diverted. So yes, so my research on that book was relatively easy. And also the fact that I was not dealing with an historical character. And we all feel that we know Jane Austen's characters very well, but of course they were purely fiction. And in theory, you could do whatever you want with them. When I came to do my second novel, which was set in Renaissance Italy in the 16th century, it was a completely different matter. And this book is called The Devil's Tune, and I wrote it under my pen name, Fran Kempton, and it is a novel of music, murder, and revenge. And this time I was writing about an actual historical character, Carlo Gesualdo, who was a prince, a composer, and a murderer. And he murdered his wife and her lover in rather gruesome fashion. And it caused an enormous scandal at the time that everyone, all the courts of Europe were agog with it. And here is Gesualdo coming up. Rather a strange looking man, very narrow face, thin lips, very long musician's hands, and a very Gothic character altogether. He's been described as a sadomasochist. He had a really, really strange life and background. Many of the things I unearthed about him, I couldn't possibly tell you on a respectable Zoom like this. But one of the quirkier things I found out about him was that after he murdered his wife, he had all the trees around his castle cut down because he was afraid that his wife's family would send soldiers to kill him, and he wanted to be able to see they were coming. And I wondered if he'd been reading Macbeth, sort of Birnam Woods and Dunsinane and all that. Also the book, although it is about Gesualdo, it is narrated by a maidservant called Laura Scala, who vowed revenge on the prince for the murder of her mistress and spends her whole life trying to achieve this. And in one of the periods of her life, she's in Venice and about to get married, and on her wedding eve, she boils a concoction of artichoke roots in wine and then drank the concoction. And this was supposed to lessen the rank smell of the armpits at a time when people didn't bathe or hardly ever, and if you were one of the poor, probably never, which I thought was rather an intriguing thing to discover. And at least it's a green solution, isn't it? No plastic involved there. So I don't know, I think you can see next to Gesualdo, the courtyard of the palace with the skull ornament in the front, carved stone ornament, which it really emphasizes the Gothic nature of the whole place. His castle is as sinister as he was, so it's all the pattern. And I think I share probably with a couple of the other panelists a problem, that is, when you are writing about an actual historical character, how do you do them justice? How far can you fictionalize their life? it's difficult enough for us to put ourselves in the characters of our grandparents, you know, and to imagine how they lived and felt. So it's even more difficult if you're talking about someone who lived hundreds of years ago. And in the case of Gesualdo, although his trial for the murder of his wife is well documented, there were large areas of his life that we didn't know anything about, and that's the area which I fictionalized and tried to imagine that this is possibly what would have happened. And I think the acid test, as they say, for historical novelists is when you read the story, you say to yourself, yes, this is how it must have been, or if it wasn't, then it should have been, you know. And that was what was in my mind when I was writing my books. And the contrast with the two books, the first one was very light-hearted and meant to be light-hearted, and it was very enjoyable to write. And I was taking the character of Lydia Bennett in Pride and Prejudice, you know, the bad girl of the family, and sort of having fun with her. And you know, the difference with doing that and coming to someone who actually lived and was a pretty nasty character as well, it was quite a strain, really, actually. And trying to research initially is not easy. When I got to Naples, I found that the state archives had been completely obliterated, bombed by the Allies during the Second World War. And many of the museums in Italy tend to have a notice on the door saying closed for restoration, lunch or whatever, you know. And if you ask someone when will the staff be back, they just shrug their shoulders and say, chissà, who knows. So I had to persevere with the research. But there is no substitute for actually being there and seeing the place and discovering these strange facts, quirky facts that one author described as looking in the linings of history. And so I'm very glad I did it. And even though researching in Italy required determination, lots of coffee and stops for ice cream in the heat, but yes, I had to be there to see it. And so, yes, those are my quirky facts. And I think I'm now going to introduce Heather.
Thank you, Jean. Let me just sort out the screen share 1 second. So the research that I'm going to be talking about today was in aid of this book, The Undoing of Arlo Knott, which is published by Orbit. And the first thing I'm going to talk about is the tale of St. George and the Dragon. This is because my character Arlo Knott wants to be a hero, but he never quite makes it. And so there's this kind of undercurrent of St. George and the Dragon running beneath the novel. And the mysterious hidden gem I discovered while researching St. George and the Dragon was that there was a magic orange tree involved. So just to tell you a bit about the myth, if St. George really did exist, he was probably a Christian tortured by Emperor Diocletian in around 300 AD. So the story may have existed as early as the 6th century, probably as an oral history before it began to be written down from around the 12th century onwards. And the story of St. George as a warrior saint grows, and it gets more extravagant the more it's told. In early versions, there's no fight with the dragon. The dragon is more of a poisonous worm that gets subdued by the power of the cross. So the setting also moves around. It's been set in Turkey, Libya, and Egypt. And why set it there? Well, it's probably because stuffed crocodiles had been brought back from the east by the Crusaders, and so it was more believable that dragons could exist over there. So the story gets retold and retold over the ages, and by the time of the Reformation, St. George is a knight of England, travelling the world as a soldier. He winds up in Egypt, plagued by a massive dragon with burning wings. So the dragon is very big and scary by this point. And by now he's having a proper fight with the dragon. So it's still poisonous, but in the valley where the fight takes place, there's a mysterious orange tree. And it's so pure that no venomous creature can come near. St. George manages to crawl beneath this orange tree, and the dragon can't get to him. He can also eat an orange and heals all of his disease and wounds, and restores him, making him able to kill the dragon. So this is the part that just kind of caught my imagination, because I was so kind of bringing this myth alongside the story of my character. The orange got into the book somehow. It's only a really small element, but I just found that Arlo was recovering from his fight in a hospital full of a courtyard full of orange trees, and the colour orange gets associated subtly with life and healing in the book, just kind of naturally. The next thing I'm going to talk about, completely different. Yes, my facts are all very strange and quite different, is quantum physics. So it's in the book because Arlo Nott's sister is a quantum physicist. And the reason I kind of got into quantum physics a bit in this fiction novel is that I just wanted to explore if there was any way Arlo Nott's strange ability to undo his last action, which I should probably have said earlier is the kind of concept behind the book. What if you could undo your last action as though you kind of had an undo button for life? What if there's any way that could be a real thing, if you could mess around with timelines, etc.? So hence quantum physics. And it's such a weird area. I could have picked a million things to tell you about, but what I've chosen is backwards causality, which is basically the fact that experiments have shown that the future can influence the past. So one thing you need to know about quantum physics is that measuring what particles are doing changes what they do. It's like making a nature documentary. You can't observe a system of animals without affecting them. It's like if you chase a group of dolphins in a boat, they behave differently. So scientists get around this by using kind of weak measurements. They do the same experiment lots and lots of times and they get a correlation. How did they prove that time goes backwards? Well, they measured a certain thing about particles, their spin. It's so-called, think of it as like the spin of a cricket ball. And they measured what the particles were doing at a certain time of day, like 2 o'clock, for instance. And then they started measuring it at a later time as well. So it was, for example, 2 o'clock and 3 o'clock each day. And when they did the 3 o'clock measurement, they found out that the 2 o'clock measurement changed. So doing the measurement later on caused the earlier measurement to be different. Therefore, time flows backwards. Stay with me. So why isn't it front page news? It's relatively recent. I'm simplifying it massively, and it's all done on a tiny, tiny scale with all the difficulty of quantum experiments. So everything has to be kept near freezing. It doesn't work every time. They literally did this experiment hundreds of thousands of times to prove that this effect happens. But they did find an effect, and this means that time is like a string, and a movement at either end seems to affect the middle, which is just fascinating on a personal scale. You could bring it into discussions around, does fate exist? Are there things in our future pulling us forwards? Do we have free will? Basically, this research showed me that quantum physics is so weird and so kind of against all of our instincts that it does allow a speculative fiction writer to take a strange idea like the undoing of Arlo Nott and say, could it exist? So, third thing, and anyone who has a fear of rats, please appreciate the fact that I have chosen a very friendly cartoon rat for this slide. I'm actually going to talk about landmines, my third interesting fact, because I had to look into landmines because my character decides to do some landmine clearing volunteering at some point. And so I was looking into the right country to choose for him to go to, the right kind of landmine for him to be working with. And, you know, if any of you are seeing the connection with the rat already, then well done. Basically, I found out that landmines are very different depending on what country they're used in. In Cambodia, there's loads of mines. They're fairly easy to detect because they're mostly metal, so you can use a metal detector. In countries like Colombia, however, they're mostly improvised mines, plastic, glass bottles filled with explosives, often very little metal, so quite hard to detect. And the interesting fact I came across, which has since made it into the news, so it's a little bit less obscure, is that rats are trained to and used in landmine detection, specifically giant pouched rats from Africa. They're good at it because they're light and they can smell TNT. Rats have been used in Mozambique, Cambodia, and Angola, and can check 200 square meters in 20 minutes. So that would take a human 4 days to do. So it was, the rats didn't actually make it into the novel. It was just an interesting kind of thing that I came across that I think one of the rats has now been given a gold medal, hence it was on the BBC News website. But yeah, I found that quite interesting. So yeah, all of this went into the book and helped tell the story of kind of what happened to Arlo and his strange career. We don't have very much time left because we did start a little bit late. If anyone has any burning questions, if you want to put them in the chat, then please feel free. I'm just reading about the stuffed crocodiles comment. Yes. Otherwise, we're all members of the Authors Collective Just Right Bristol, and there's a link to our website and our book shop in the chat. So do have a look at our books. There's a whole bunch of fascinating stuff in there. Oh, I'm sorry, there's a question.
There's a question, yeah.
That's very helpful of me, isn't it? How much use did you make of librarians and archivists directly when you did your research? Does anyone want to answer that?
Heather, there's one other question directed to you. Do you have a scientific background? Sorry, just because you've just been speaking. That was an excellent summary of quantum physics. I think we celebrate that moment.
Just to quickly answer that, no, I don't. I am interested in science, and I read a lot of books on quantum physics, and I spoke to 2 quantum physicists to get them to make it clear for me, because it is really hard to get your head around.
Shall I go with the library one?
Yeah.
I did use libraries to the extent that I could in writing in the blink of an eye. But of course, a lot of the material was in Scotland, and I don't live there, at least not anymore. So it was sometimes quite difficult. I did have a couple of trips to London to see exhibitions and to go to the National Portrait Gallery. But I do tend to find that once you start delving into a subject, it's such a huge advantage if you just happen to meet an expert. And I was very lucky, and at a photographic festival, I met an expert on calotyping. So he became my guiding hand as much as any librarian or book, really, although they did play their part. Don't know if anyone else wants to come in on that.
Well, I, as I said in my little talk, I did spend a lot of time in the Central Library in Bath, because it's a wonderful archive for everything connected with Jane Austen and the Regency period. And I also found, especially with the Italian book, that being able to access libraries on the net is very useful as well. And there's huge amounts of information stored there, and some of it you have to actually pay for, but there's quite a lot that's free. And that was a big help, because although I did go to Italy, I wasn't there I don't do so much while I was there. So the libraries were very useful, and I was able to read the transcript of Gesualdo's trial online. So yes, never underestimate the value of the internet.
I would agree with that, Jean. But I also think what's really very useful as a sort of resource is obviously librarians and archivists, but also reading other literature based in the area that you're studying, because you get different voices and different sort of different feel for what you're researching, which sends you and opens your research channels. So there are lots of ways of researching and coming at it that can be very rich and very fulfilling.
I think it can also depend on how conscientious you are. I've known some novelists who've said, oh, I do research to the level of the children's encyclopedia, because so as not to get, too much down a rabbit hole, so to, keep writing the book. But I need to know, I need to understand it. I need to get into depth with anything I'm researching. Because otherwise, how are you going to feed it into the subconscious and out into something fascinating?
I think that's true. I think sometimes as well you need to research more, but also abandon quite a lot of it. So I think usually, I don't know if you will find this, the other panelists, but sometimes your first draft could be so full of detail and fact that when you read it, it reads like a non-fiction book. So you really then have to sort of go through and discard and keep only the essentials. So you've got a really sort of good story as opposed to too much detail, which can be quite off-putting, I find.
Absolutely, and there's no substitute for seeing, an artifact from the period in the flesh, as it were. I mean, a friend who happened to collect guns showed me an authentic dueling pistol from the Regency era, and just being able to handle it and sort of look at it was, I found was, not just fascinating, but it really sort of opened up something I could write about.
I find there's also kind of two stages. I start off, well, I'm now on my second historical book, being rather terrified that I'll miss something or that I'll get something wrong. But when you get to a different point where you think, well, I know it was really like this, but you feel less afraid to actually deviate somehow, because you know what happened. You don't mind, you're more prepared to be more creative in what you do with it, I think. But you do have to have that sort of basis, or at least I do, which I hope's a bit beyond the children's encyclopedia. But
and if you get something wrong, someone is sure to write in and tell you. They always do.
Definitely.
Oh, there's another question for you, Heather.
Yeah, I'm just seeing about the question about the dragon myth, the idea of stuffed crocodiles and how it would have been informed by such things in Europe, taxidermy, creatures, dinosaur fossils. Yeah, I mean, it was, yeah, I don't know. I've heard of the stuffed crocodiles definitely being brought back by crusaders. I'm not sure what else they might have brought back, or if there was kind of much access to fossils and so on, given that the myth is so old, and it goes back to those early times, the 6th century. So yeah, I don't have much more information about that, but it is fascinating about, and also the most interesting thing is how, it's been co-opted as such a British story, hasn't it? George and the Dragon, when it's so kind of Eastern and he was probably Turkish and so on.
Heather, I must tell you that when I was in Georgia, the country, I was shown an icon, a very valuable icon, the only one of its kind in the world, that shows St. George killing the dragon, but it isn't a dragon. It's a sort of giant worm with the face of the Emperor Diocletian.
Oh,
Absolutely fascinating, and the only one of its kind in existence. And because, of course, St. George is the patron of Georgia as well.
Yeah, so that would be a very early icon, obviously, like back when it was a religious thing. It was mainly a religious tale, not a tale of personal daring do and heroism. I think we're going to have to wrap up there because I know that they need to kind of get things ready for the next talk. So thank you so much everyone who's attended and the Stay at Home Festival for hosting us.
Thank you.
Thank you.